Les entreprises de presse étaient autrefois des vaches à lait, c'était des secteurs extrêmement rentables. Mais aujourd'hui, il faut le reconnaître, le modèle financier des quotidiens, de la télé généraliste a beaucoup changé et faire de l'argent dans le monde des médias traditionnels n'est pas facile. Il y a quelqu'un qui s'intéresse à ces questions-là, c'est le professeur Robert Picard, qui est le directeur de la recherche à l'Institut Reuters pour les études en journalisme de l'Université Oxford. Monsieur Picard vit à Boston. Il est l'auteur de nombreux ouvrages sur l'économie des médias. C'est un expert en matière de concentration de la presse et des conséquences sur la vie démocratique. Il a publié une vingtaine d'ouvrages, toujours sur la dimension économique et financière des médias. Donc, c'est une nouvelle réalité dans laquelle nous sommes et je pense que le professeur Picard peut vraiment bien nous éclairer sur cette dimension.
Merci. It's a pleasure to be here to be able to talk about issues of ownership and concentration and their effects on politics because these are fundamental to those of us operating in democracies and trying to understand what kind of communications and media systems are needed in the 21st century as we move ahead. And I want to make it clear that media ownership and concentration aren't what we care about. And we use these terms all the time. We use media pluralism. We throw these around, but that's not what we care about. In fact, having multiple owners does create conditions where you're more likely to have diversity and pluralism, but it doesn't guarantee it. But we use these terms because they help us think about other things. And we can use them as shorthand, if you will, without having to deal with broader concepts. They're the proxies for dealing with issues we are worried about the manipulation of the flow of news and information. We are worried about powerful influences or powerful people interests controlling public conversation. We're worried about some people not being able to speak and be heard in society. We're worried that large companies might use their market power to mistreat us as individuals and to mistreat competitors. All of these things come into these discussions of ownership and concentration, but they are not inevitable, but they can occur. And so I want to reflect on that a bit today and tell you a bit about what's happening in the United Kingdom, what's happening in Europe with relation to these kind of issues, because they become rather significant policy issues in recent days. And of course, I'd like to preface that a little bit by saying we're having this conversation today because there's worry about a local proprietor. And almost all these conversations, whenever they take place anywhere, are because of either worries about a proprietor or bad behavior by a proprietor. And then they come and we deal with them, they go away and they come back again at some other time. So we have to take an understanding that most of our concern is really based around a few proprietors, whether it be Berlusconi or Murdoch or anyone else that we want to name along the way. We are also very convoluted when we talk about ownership. And in fact, I always love to read books about ownership of media from people who are very critical of the media. Because when you read them, you find out they don't like any form of ownership. And this becomes the problem. We don't like private ownership because we say, well, some proprietors are going to use it for their own private interest. Do they? Yes, they do. We don't like public ownership and corporate ownership because, well, they're concerned about profit and the social interests can be ignored along the way. We don't like just having public service media because they can't engage in political discourse, because if that's all we have, the range of materials we get and the genres we get are more narrowed. We don't like big companies because, well, they can be arrogant. They can control content. They can control the markets, so we don't like them. We don't like small companies because small companies sometimes can't withstand pressures from powerful interests, and they don't have enough resources to give us the range and quality of content that we want. We don't like foreign owners. We can't have those. Certainly not. Every nation in the world restricts foreign ownership in some form or another, and the reason is they don't share our national identity. They don't represent us very well. They can affect national sovereignty. There's lots of reasons that we don't like them. We don't like domestic owners because they're too close to those in power and become a problem. So what are we supposed to do? And this is the problem of often the discussions of ownership. And the reality is there are no good or bad forms of ownership themselves. They all have disadvantages. They all have advantages. What there are good and bad owners in all those forms. And it's not the form of ownership, but it's those that operate them. And this creates a lot of problems when we try to create national media policies and policies around who should operate broadcasting and who should operate print and deal with these. Because company size is important to national policy. And this is really a problem everywhere. National industrial policies, and Canada is a great example of this, promote the building of large domestic companies because they support the domestic economy and they allow competition with foreign companies that are large. Especially small countries worry about this issue along the way. And it's important for us to get expensive communications infrastructures built. Small companies can't do it. Large companies have to be present to do it. So we have these problems, especially now that the state is not investing in these critical infrastructures. So that becomes an issue. Cultural policy gets in the way because most nations want to have large domestic companies because they can increase the range of domestic output. So we want that along the way. But to do that, we often have to get concentrated companies. When national broadcast licensing takes place, there's not a place in any of the democratic countries that have been very open to foreign companies. They've always preferred to give additional channels to domestic companies rather than to let foreign companies in for the reasons we discussed further. And when bad economic times come along, almost universally, policymakers will waive consolidation rules and concentration rules and saying, well, it's bad times, they have to be able to consolidate. So all of these conflicting things come into our arguments over what kind of pluralism, what kind of ownership should we have, and how are we going to change that. Now, what does this all mean? The fact is, every nation in the world, media are concentrated. They are far concentrated than any other industry in every nation of the world. Having 3 to 4 major companies control an industry is not common in other industries. But in the media industries, it's very common across the world. And that is something we have to recognize, that partly there's economic imperatives that come behind that, as well as all these national industrial policies that come there. Now, what does this do to our democracies is really the question. And Paolo eloquently made the case that we have to think about differences between transitional democracies and established liberal democracies. And in established liberal democracies, there have been a great deal of research that have absolutely looked at what are the effects on politics. Actually, having concentrated media has very little effect on voters who are committed to a party or candidate. But what it can do is affect undecided or uncommitted voters. And the nature of that effect in all the studies that have been done has been about 5 to 15% swing. Well, a 5 to 15% swing in terms of a party or a candidate can win an election in many places because that's enough to make it work. And so it's very important. There's been also the look at what negative advertising can do, or very negative press coverage can do. Negative advertising and negative media coverage doesn't change an election much, and it doesn't change people's opinions much. What it does is keep certain blocks of people from voting because they say, they're all the same. And so all of a sudden, what you've got then is a reestablishment of whatever the existing orders are along the way. And one of the reasons that there is so much money spent, for instance, in the US on negative advertising, and it's coming here to Canada as in all the elections as I watch it here, is the fact that you're trying to get that swing voter to stay out of the equation. Don't go to the polls. And then we can win with our on the other side of it. And so there's a lot of very interesting kind of problems. There's a number of studies that show actually family ownership is worse than corporate ownership, something many people say would not occur. Certainly as you had corporate ownership of media expanding in the 80s and 90s, everybody was really panicked about that. All of the studies have shown essentially that family ownership is actually more likely to try to influence local politics than corporate are likely to do so. And so you get all kinds of very interesting problems associated with ownership in liberal democracies and what they can do in terms of the political process. Now, these kind of concerns have led the European Union since the 1970s to really be concerned about the issues of media ownership. And in fact, if you look back in the libraries, you will find that the Commission of the European Communities, as it was called then, made a massive investment to study media ownership in all of the member states at that time and produced very, very good studies of media ownership in the member states along the way. What sparked that concern was some people such as Robert Dassault in France. Of course, he was a member of the National Assembly. For those of us that are old enough, we may have bumped into him along the way. He owned Le Figaro and François. He owned a huge network of local regional papers and really used them to help his party and himself come along. At the same time, you had in Germany Axel Springer. Axel Springer was a very interesting change for Germany because the Allies after the war had basically said, we're not going to have national media in Germany. We know where that leads. We don't want to do it there again. And so we established a system of regional rather than national media. He was very big in the regional playing, particularly around Bonn. But then he ends up with Die Welt and Bild, which he builds into very national players, promoting a highly conservative agenda along the way. So the European Commission began responding to this, saying, wait a minute, this is problematic in terms of the ideals of democratic participation that we want, and raised the issues, but never did anything. And the reason it never did anything is it didn't have the political and legal competence to do anything, because these are issues for national states to deal with, and nation states had to deal with it, but they could raise the issue. Then they forgot about it for a while and let it go. Some of the nation states began dealing with it. Some of the member states dealt with it in different ways. You saw, for instance, in the UK, the placing of limits on how much newspapers and television you could own. If you go past, I think it's 25%, you can't own a television license. Germany had another formula of that sort to try to limit such things. These were special media policy ones that went beyond competition policy regulations along the way. And then Rupert Murdoch arrived in the United Kingdom. Now, Rupert Murdoch's a really interesting character. Rupert Murdoch doesn't care about politics. And that sounds very strange because he has been so involved in politics. This is a man that really is not ideological at all. He is driven by ambition. He's driven by ambition for his company. He'll change sides whenever it's useful. He wants to be close to power, whether it's conservatives or liberals in power. He doesn't care along the way. He does not like elites. He really hates the aristocracy. They didn't treat him well when he was at Oxford, which is the primary reason. And, well, he's from down under there in Australia, and it's, Commonwealth, but way away, so he was not treated very well. And so a lot of what he did when he came back to the UK was to use his ownership of the Times and the Sun to skewer the aristocracy and the elites that he was not part of. And then he would move from one side to another when it was useful. Then he moved to the US. And I still have trouble trying to figure out what he is. Sometimes he's Australian. Sometimes he's American. Sometimes he's British. He kind of plays these obscurity games whenever it's useful, depending on what he's trying to do. He did become an American citizen so he could buy television stations, because the U.S. has the foreign ownership rule that you can't buy more than a third of a television station if you're not a citizen. So he became a citizen. He was a good friend of Ronald Reagan and got citizenship in 9 months, which is rather unusual, to say the least. But he does this. He likes power. Right now he's cozying up to the Clintons, which is kind of an interesting thing on the side. The UK has been dealing with the issue of pluralism in recent years. A year ago, there was a very large set of hearings and inquiry in the House of Lords about media pluralism in Europe. It is expanding, actually, the definition of media pluralism. Media pluralism has traditionally, in the United Kingdom, been defined by pluralism in the press. They didn't worry about pluralism in broadcasting because they have an impartiality rule in broadcasting. And in fact, it's followed quite well. And so BBC is very impartial. Sky News, which is Murdoch owns a third of it, I think, at the time, is actually very credible news. It's not Fox News. It's actually quite credible news. It has to be, because it has to compete against the BBC. And it's very impartial along the way. Oh, yes, it supports democracy and capitalism and things of that sort, but those are somehow taken outside of the discussion of impartiality. But those issues were there. They were worried not only about issues of ownership of the press, but where the press is located. Part of the problem in the UK is 85% of the circulation is from London. Much of the regions are not well covered. Much of the regions have very little news that is available to them from that region. The same in broadcasting, because of the dominance of the London-based broadcasting. So there's looking at that. They're looking at minorities. They're looking at the whole range of things that had not traditionally been covered before. And now they have directed Ofcom to make a new inquiry into how that should change some rules. So we're watching that very, very carefully. What has happened most recently is that Ed Miliband, who is the Labour leader, has just announced that if the Labour is elected, they will put in a rule that says you cannot own more than 1/3 of the circulation of the press. They set the 34%, because 33 1/3, so they rounded it up to 34. Only one proprietor will be affected by that, and that is Rupert Murdoch. If that goes into place, he will either have to sell the Times, or he'll have to sell the Sunday Times, or he'll have to sell the Sun. He has now directed his editors, and that's been released by journalists, on his papers, that they are to completely oppose Miliband and Labour in this, because he couldn't break up the company. Of course, he is now recovering from the loss of the News of the World as a result of the scandals over phone hacking, and from the wounds that he received during the Leveson inquiry, which showed how he influenced politics. The one really interesting thing about the Leveson inquiry is everything you ever thought was wrong about cozy relationships between media and politicians is now on the record. It's all there. And you don't have to say, well, I think they're doing this, or that. You can actually say, here's the testimony that shows it. And so it's quite an interesting time in the UK. At the European level, for about the past 7 or 8 years, the European Parliament has been seriously pushing the European Commission to pay more attention to media pluralism in two places. One, pan-European, and also in certain southeastern European member states where transitional democracies, if you will. And particularly places like Hungary and Romania and other such things like that are having very interesting problems with oligarchs and others in their systems. The European Commission was not particularly interested in dealing with it, but the Parliament kept pushing them. They finally, in 2009, established a study group, of which I was part, to develop a technique for monitoring threats to media pluralism and political diversity. Last year, they sponsored a pilot test of that in 10 nations, I think it was, and they're now going to do that in all of the nations because the Parliament wants it. What the outcome will be, we don't know. The Commission is really uncomfortable with the idea of media pluralism and ownership limits, mainly because it wants big European firms to be able to compete with big American firms. Okay? So now we're getting back into industrial policy and into cultural policies and things coming in against some of these media pluralism policies. So we get some very interesting problems now as we're watching what is happening there. And this, of course, brings us back to the problems that you're having here in Quebec with the concentration that's going on. And again, in the end, you have to start looking at, well, if we can't effectively regulate ownership per se, can we regulate behavior? Are there incentives for better behavior? Are there requirements for better behavior? Are there other ways that we can achieve the outcomes that we want? We have seen, for instance, Finland, which had one of the largest press subsidy systems in the world for about 30 years, has now taken most of the press subsidy away from the press and given it to the parties based on their representation in Parliament as an information subsidy. And they said, use it in any way you want. You want to use it all in digital? Fine. You want to take advertising in some place? That's fine. You want to use it on a political paper? That's fine. But people are now starting to experiment with different ways of trying to deal with the underlying issues rather than just the symptomatic issues of ownership and concentration, and trying to get to how do you communicate with citizens better? How do you inform them? How do you debate with them? How do you bring them into the process? And that's really what we're trying to accomplish with all of these issues that we're dealing with. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert.